A quiet diner worker risks everything for a stranger who's more than he seems. Betrayal, sacrifice, and a veteran's hidden past unravel in a story that'll grip your heart. Stay to uncover the truth. Hit like, subscribe, and ring the bell for stories that give you chills. The diner smelled of burnt coffee and grease, its neon sign buzzing faintly over the sleepy coastal town of Havens End. It was 2 in the morning, and Samuel, a 62-year-old man with greying hair and a slight stoop, mopped the checkered floor. His navy jacket, faded from years of wear, hung loosely on his wiry frame. The fluorescent lights cast a sickly glow, making his tired eyes look deeper, like they carried stories he'd never tell. He moved with quiet purpose, the mop's rhythmic swish the only sound in the empty diner. Havens End was a place where dreams came to fade, and Samuel knew that better than most. Once, he'd wanted to be a teacher, shaping young minds with history and hope. He'd saved for years, taking night classes while working double shifts at a cannery. But life had other plans. His wife, Clara, got sick, and the medical bills ate his savings like wildfire. When she passed 7 years ago, Samuel was left with a mortgage, a broken heart, and a teaching dream buried under debt. Now, he worked the graveyard shift at Rosie's Diner, serving truckers and drifters who passed through this forgotten corner of Maine. His hands, calloused from decades of labour, still held a gentleness, and his smile, though rare, was warm enough to thaw the coldest night. He'd learned to find sparks of hope in small things. A regular's grateful nod, the sunrise over the pier, or the old radio playing Sinatra in the kitchen. Tonight, though, his eyes kept drifting to the window, where the foggy ocean churned under a starless sky. Something felt off, like the air was holding its breath. Samuel shook it off, chalking it up to another sleepless night, and kept mopping. He didn't know it yet, but the next few hours would change everything. At 2:30, the diner's bell jingled, a sharp sound that made Samuel pause. He turned, expecting a trucker or a lost tourist, but instead saw an elderly man, maybe 78, shuffling in. His green army coat was tattered, the hem frayed, and his grey trousers were patched with mismatched fabric. A white beard framed his weathered face, and his boots, held together with duct tape, squeaked on the wet floor. He clutched a small bundle, a faded dog tag and a crumpled photo, his hands trembling slightly. His eyes, deep and haunted, scanned the diner before settling on a corner booth. Samuel watched him sit, his movements slow, like every step cost him something. The man didn't look up, didn't call for service, just stared at the table, his fingers tracing the dog tag's edge. Samuel's first thought was to let him be. Rosie's had a strict no loitering policy, and the manager, Carl, was a stickler for rules. But something about the man's hunched shoulders, the way he seemed to shrink into the booth, tugged at Samuel's heart. He'd seen that look before, in his own reflection after Clara's funeral. Without a word, Samuel poured a mug of coffee, the steam rising in the chilly air, and grabbed a day-old blueberry muffin from the counter. He walked over, his boots soft on the floor, and set the items down gently. "On the house," Samuel said, his voice low, like he was afraid to startle the man. The stranger's eyes flicked up, surprise mixing with suspicion. "I ain't got money, son," he rasped, his voice rough as gravel. Samuel shook his head, offering a small smile. "Don't need it, just looked like you could use something warm." The man stared at the coffee, then at Samuel, as if weighing his intentions. Finally, he nodded, wrapping his hands around the mug, the warmth easing his tremors. "Thank you," he whispered, barely audible, and took a sip. Samuel stepped back, respecting the man's space, and returned to his mop. But he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a random encounter. The dog tag, the man's guarded posture. It hinted at a story buried deep. Samuel didn't pry. He'd learned long ago that some wounds only heal in silence. Instead, he kept an eye on the man, refilling his coffee when it ran low, each gesture quiet but deliberate. By 3, the diner was still empty, the fog outside thickening. The old man hadn't eaten the muffin, just crumbled it absently, his gaze lost in the photo he held. Samuel, wiping down the counter, noticed the photo's edge, a faded image of a young soldier, proud in uniform. He didn't ask about it, but the sight stirred something in him. A memory of his father, a Korean War vet, who'd carried a similar photo until the day he died. Samuel's father had taught him that respect wasn't just words. It was seeing someone's worth, no matter how broken they seemed. So when the man's head dipped, exhaustion winning, Samuel grabbed a clean dish towel and draped it over his shoulders like a makeshift blanket. "Rest easy," Samuel murmured, though he wasn't sure the man heard. The act felt right, like a promise to his father's memory. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the diner's windows, but inside, a quiet trust began to form. The old man stirred, glancing at Samuel with something new in his eyes. Gratitude, maybe, or recognition. "You're a good man," he said suddenly, his voice stronger now. Samuel shrugged, uncomfortable with praise. "Just doing my job." But the man shook his head, clutching the dog tag tighter. Not everyone would. Samuel didn't know it, but that small act of kindness had just set something extraordinary in motion. The old man stayed in the corner booth, his hands cradling the coffee mug like it was a lifeline. Samuel, now wiping down the counter, kept his movements slow, giving the stranger space to breathe. The diner's radio crackled with a faint jazz tune, its notes weaving through the quiet like a whispered promise. Every so often, the man's eyes drifted to the crumpled photo, his fingers brushing its worn edges. Samuel caught glimpses, a young soldier's proud stance, a medal pinned to his chest, a smile that time had stolen. He didn't ask questions. He'd seen enough of life to know some stories only come when they're ready. Instead, he brought a second muffin, this time apple cinnamon, and set it down without a word. The man looked up, his white beard catching the dim light, and nodded, a silent thank you. Samuel noticed the dog tag again, its metal dulled, but engraved with faint letters, USMC, a year too worn to read. His father's voice echoed in his mind. "Odd. Every vet's got a story, Sam. Respect the ones who don't tell." So Samuel kept the coffee flowing, each refill a quiet vow to honor that. By 4 in the morning, the man spoke again, his voice low but steady. "Used to fish off the pier," he said, eyes on the photo. "Me and my boy, every summer." Samuel paused, leaning on the counter, his face soft. "Sounds like good times." The man's lips twitched, not quite a smile. "Best I ever had. He's gone now, long gone." Samuel's chest tightened. He knew that kind of loss too well. "I'm sorry," he said, and meant it. The man waved a hand, like swatting away the pity. "You keep a man warm, that's something. Ain't many do that." Samuel shrugged, his cheeks warming. "Just coffee and a muffin." But the man's eyes, sharp now, held his. "More'n that, son, more'n that." The moment lingered, a thread of trust tying them together in the empty diner. Outside, Haven's End was waking up, the first fishermen heading to the docks, their boots crunching on gravel. Inside Rosie's, the world felt smaller, like it was just Samuel, the old man, and the ghosts they both carried. But the town wasn't as quiet as it seemed. By 6, the breakfast crowd trickled in. Dock workers, shopkeepers, and a few retirees who treated the diner like a second home. They noticed the old man in the corner, his tattered coat and duct-taped boots standing out like a sore thumb. Some nodded his way, others whispered, their eyes flicking to Samuel as he poured their coffee. "That's the guy from the pier," muttered Frank, a grizzled fisherman with a permanent scowl. "Been hanging around for weeks, trouble waiting to happen." Samuel kept his face neutral, refilling Frank's mug. "He's just eating, Frank. No harm done." But the whispers spread, like ripples on the harbour. Marge, the florist, leaned over her pancakes, her voice carrying. "Carl won't like this, Sam. You know how he is about strays." Samuel's jaw tightened, but he forced a smile. "I'll handle Carl." The truth was, he wasn't so sure. Carl, the diner's manager, was a wiry man in his 50s who ran Rosie's like a dictator. "No freeloaders, no exceptions," he'd bark, his eyes cold as the winter tide. Samuel had seen him toss out hungry kids for lingering too long, citing business standards. But Samuel wasn't Carl, and the old man wasn't some kid. He glanced at the booth, where the man was finally nibbling the muffin, and felt a quiet resolve settle in his bones. The morning rush brought more eyes, more murmurs. Some regulars, like old Mrs. Delaney, slipped Samuel a smile, her wrinkled hand patting his as he cleared her plate. "You're a good soul, Sammy," she said, loud enough for others to hear. But not everyone was so kind. Tommy, a cocky dock worker in his 30s, smirked as he paid his bill. "Running a soup kitchen now, Sam? Better watch it, or Carl will have your hide." Samuel ignored him, but the jab stung. He'd worked at Rosie's for 5 years. Never missed a shift, never complained. But he knew his place. Replaceable, just another pair of hands to mop the floor. By 8, the diner was packed, the air thick with bacon grease and gossip. Samuel kept moving, bussing tables, pouring coffee, but he felt the weight of every stare. The old man stayed put, sipping slowly, his eyes on the window now, like he was watching for something or someone. Samuel wondered about the boy in the photo, the summers on the pier, but he didn't press. Instead, he slipped a fresh napkin under the man's mug, a small gesture that earned a grunt of thanks. It was enough. But trouble was brewing, and Samuel should have seen it coming. At 9, Carl stormed in, his keys jangling like a jailer's. He was in a mood, his face red from a bad night or a worse morning. The diner quieted as he scanned the room, his gaze landing on the old man's booth. Samuel's stomach dropped. "Sam!" Carl barked, jerking his head toward the kitchen. "Back room, now." Samuel followed, his boots heavy, leaving the old man to his coffee. The kitchen smelled of burnt toast and bleach, the cook's too busy to eavesdrop. Carl rounded on him, his voice low but sharp. "You giving out free meals to bums now?" Samuel stood tall, his hands clasped behind his back. "I paid for it, Carl, my own money." Carl's eyes narrowed, like he'd caught Samuel stealing. "Don't care. You know the rules. No handouts. It brings more of 'em, and we ain't a charity." "He's not hurting anyone," Samuel said, his voice steady but firm. "He's a vet, Carl. Deserves a little respect." Carl scoffed, spitting into a sink. "Vet, huh? Looks like a drunk to me." "You're on thin ice, Sam. One more stunt like this, and you're out." Samuel's fists clenched, but he nodded, biting back the words burning his throat. He'd heard threats before, but this one felt different, like a line drawn in the sand. Back in the diner, the old man was still there, oblivious to the storm brewing. Samuel forced a smile, topping off his coffee, but his mind raced. He couldn't afford to lose this job, not with the mortgage, the bills, the life he was barely holding together. But he couldn't turn his back on the man either. Something about those haunted eyes, that dog tag, felt like a test he couldn't fail. By noon, the tension in Rosie's was thicker than the fog outside. The lunch crowd brought fresh faces, and with them, fresh opinions. Some, like Jenny the librarian, slipped Samuel a tip with a whispered, "You did good, hun." But others weren't so kind. A group of construction workers at the counter grumbled loudly, their voices carrying. "This place is going downhill," one said, glaring at the old man's booth. Used to be respectable. Samuel ignored them, but the words cut deep. He'd always been the guy who kept the peace, who smoothed things over. Now, he was the center of a storm he hadn't asked for. Worse, he caught Tommy whispering to Carl near the register, their heads bent close. Tommy's smirk said it all. Trouble was coming, and Samuel was the target. The old man, sensing the shift, started to gather his things, his movements slow and deliberate. Samuel rushed over, his voice low. "You don't have to go. Stay as long as you need." The man's eyes met his, sharp and searching. "You're stirring up a hornet's nest, son. Don't need to do that for me." Samuel shook his head, his jaw tight. "Not about need, it's about right." The man studied him, then nodded, settling back into the booth. But the air in Rosie's was electric now, like a storm about to break. Carl was back by 1, his mood darker than before. He didn't call Samuel to the kitchen this time, just stood by the counter, arms crossed, watching the old man like a hawk. The regulars noticed, their chatter dying down. Samuel kept working, but his heart pounded, sweat beading under his collar. He knew Carl was waiting for an excuse, any reason to make good on his threat. And then it happened. The old man, trying to stand, knocked over his mug, the coffee splashing across the table and onto the floor. The crash echoed, heads turning, eyes wide. Carl pounced, striding over with a glare that could curdle milk. "That's it," he snapped, pointing at the door. "Out, and don't come back." Samuel stepped between them, his voice calm but unyielding. "It was an accident, Carl. I'll clean it up." Carl's face twisted, his finger jabbing Samuel's chest. "You don't call the shots here. You're done too. Pack your stuff." The diner went silent, forks frozen mid-bite. The old man froze, his hands trembling, the dog tag glinting in the light. Samuel's blood roared in his ears, but he didn't back down. "You want me gone, fine, but he stays until he's ready to go." Carl laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "You're nobody, Sam, nobody. Get out before I call the cops." The words hit like a punch. But Samuel stood his ground, his eyes locked on Carl's. The old man spoke up, his voice shaky but clear. "Leave the boy alone. I'll go." But Samuel shook his head, his voice low and fierce. "No, sir, you're staying. This is bigger than a spilled mug." The standoff stretched, the diner holding its breath. Finally, Carl stormed to the phone, dialing with a smirk. Samuel knew what was coming. Cops, eviction, maybe worse. But he looked at the old man, saw the dog tag, the photo. the weight of a life lived hard, and knew he'd made the right call, even if it cost him everything. The diner's silence was deafening, broken only by the faint hum of the neon sign outside. Samuel stood firm, his boots planted between Carl and the old man, his heart hammering like a war drum. The old man's hands shook as he clutched his dog tag, his eyes wide with guilt, like he'd caused this mess. Carl, phone in hand, barked into the receiver, his voice dripping with venom. "Yeah, I need an officer at Rosie's. Got a trespasser and an employee who's lost his damn mind." Samuel's throat tightened, but he didn't flinch. He'd lost too much already. Clara, his dreams, his hope for a better life. But this? Standing up for a stranger who'd seen more pain than most? This was a fight he wouldn't walk away from. The regulars watched, some with pity, others with disapproval, their whispers like needles in his skin. Mrs. Delaney clutched her purse, her eyes teary, but she stayed silent. Tommy, leaning against the counter, grinned like he'd won a bet. Samuel felt the weight of their stares, the judgment piling up, but he kept his gaze on the old man. "You don't deserve this," the old man muttered, his voice cracking. "Should have just let me go." Samuel shook his head, his voice low but fierce. "Not how it works, sir. Not today." The old man's eyes softened. A flicker of something, pride maybe, crossing his weathered face. But before he could say more, the diner's bell jingled, and 2 cops stepped in, their radios crackling. Carl pointed at Samuel and the old man, his face smug. "That's them, causing a scene, refusing to leave." The younger cop, a stocky guy with a buzz cut, approached, his hand resting on his belt. "All right, folks, let's keep this calm. You?" He nodded at Samuel. "Step aside." Samuel's fists clenched, his nails biting into his palms. Every fibre screamed to fight, to shout, to make them see the injustice. But he thought of Clara, her voice in his ear. "Pick your battles, Sam, the ones that matter." This wasn't about him anymore. It was about the old man, the dog tag, the boy in the photo who'd never fish again. He stepped back, his jaw tight, and let the cops approach the booth. The old man stood slowly, his tattered coat swaying, and raised his hands, palms out. "I'm going," he said, his voice steady now, like he'd faced worse than this. Samuel's chest burned, his eyes stinging as he watched the man shuffle toward the door. The cops didn't touch him, just flanked him, their faces unreadable. As the old man passed, he paused, his hand brushing Samuel's arm. "You did enough," he whispered, his eyes deep as the ocean. "More than enough." And then he was gone, the door swinging shut behind him, the bells jingle a hollow echo. Samuel stood frozen, the diner spinning around him. The cops turned to him next, but Carl waved them off, his smirk wider now. "He's fired. He'll leave on his own, won't you, Sam?" Samuel didn't answer. He grabbed his jacket from the back, his hands shaking, and walked out into the foggy afternoon. The pier stretched before him, its wooden planks slick with mist, the ocean roaring like it was angry too. He wanted to scream, to punch something, to make sense of the unfairness. But all he could see was the old man's face, those haunted eyes, and the dog tag that told a story he'd never hear. By evening, Samuel was back at his small apartment, the walls bare except for a photo of Clara smiling on a beach. He sat on the sagging couch, his hands clasped, staring at the floor. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the distant crash of waves. He'd lost his job, his only steady income, and for what? A cup of coffee? A muffin? A moment of decency? His savings wouldn't last a month, and Haven's End wasn't exactly brimming with jobs for a 62-year-old with no degree. He rubbed his face, his calloused hands rough against his skin, and felt the weight of it all. Clara's death, the dreams he'd buried, the life he'd let slip away. Was this what it came to? A good deed punished, a kind heart crushed? He stood, pacing, his boots thudding on the worn carpet. His eyes fell on the photo, Clara's smile like a beacon in the dark. He could almost hear her laugh, her voice teasing, "You're too stubborn for your own good, Sam." But stubborn or not, he felt like he'd failed. The old man was gone, and Samuel had nothing to show for it but a pink slip and a town full of whispers. The next morning, Haven's End was buzzing, and none of it was kind. Samuel stepped out for coffee, not at Rosie's, never again, and felt the stares before he saw them. At the general store, Mrs. Haskell, the clerk, shook her head as she rang up his order. "Heard you got yourself fired, Samuel. Over some drifter? Shame on you, stirring up trouble." He nodded, his face blank, and left without a word. On the pier, a group of fishermen glanced his way, their voices low but sharp. Thinks he's a saint, one muttered. Got what he deserved, said another. Samuel kept walking, his head down, the wind biting his face. But the worst came at the post office, where Tommy and his buddies lounged outside, their laughter cutting through the fog. Hey, hero! Tommy called, his voice dripping with mockery. Saving the world one bum at a time? Samuel's hands balled into fists, but he kept moving, his boots heavy on the gravel. He'd never been one for fights, but the betrayal stung deeper than he'd expected. These were his neighbours, his town, people he'd served coffee to for years. And now? He was a punchline, a cautionary tale. By noon, the rumours had grown legs. Some said the old man was a thief, others a con artist. One wild story claimed Samuel had been slipping him cash from the register. None of it was true, but truth didn't matter in Haven's End. Gossip was currency and Samuel was bankrupt. He avoided the diner, but he heard Carl was milking the drama, telling anyone who'd listened that Samuel had disrespected the business. Even Mrs. Delaney, who'd always been kind, was quiet now, her support drowned out by the town's judgment. Samuel felt like he was sinking, the tide of condemnation pulling him under. That night, alone in his apartment, Samuel sat at his small kitchen table, a single bulb casting harsh shadows. He pulled a shoebox from under the couch, its edges worn from years of handling. Inside were Clara's things, a locket, a letter, a faded teaching certificate he'd never finished. He lifted the locket, its silver cool against his palm, and opened it to see her face, young and radiant. Was it worth it, Clara? He whispered, his voice breaking. All this for a stranger? He closed his eyes, the memory of the old man's dog tag flashing in his mind. He thought of his father, a vet who'd come home broken but never bitter, who'd taught him that kindness was a choice, not a reward. Samuel's fingers tightened around the locket, his resolve hardening. He'd done right by the old man, no matter what the town thought. But the doubt lingered, a shadow he couldn't shake. Where was the old man now? Was he safe? Had Samuel's stand meant anything at all? He stood pacing again, the floor creaking under his weight. The phone rang, startling him. An unknown number. He ignored it, too raw for conversation. But when it rang again, he picked up, his voice gruff. Yeah? Mr. Samuel Hayes? A woman's voice, calm but official. This is Margaret Cole from the VA in Portland. We need to talk about someone you helped. Samuel's breath caught, his hand tightening on the phone. The old man? It had to be. But what she said next turned his world upside down. Samuel's hand trembled as he held the phone, the woman's voice steady but urgent. Mr. Hayes, the man you helped at Rosie's Diner. He's not just any veteran. His name is Colonel William Bill Tanner, retired Marine Corps, decorated for valor in Vietnam. Samuel's knees buckled, and he sank into a chair, the kitchen's dim bulb casting jagged shadows. A colonel? He rasped, his mind racing back to the tattered coat, the dog tag, the haunted eyes. Yes, Margaret continued. Colonel Tanner's been missing for months. He walked away from a VA facility struggling with PTSD and survivor's guilt. We've been searching for him, but he didn't want to be found until you stepped in. Samuel's throat tightened, the weight of her words sinking in. I just gave him coffee, he said, almost to himself. You did more than that, she replied, her tone softening. You saw him, Mr. Hayes. Most didn't. He's safe now, back in care, and he asked us to find you. Said you reminded him why he fought in the first place. Samuel stared at the floor, Clara's locket still clutched in his other hand. The old man, Colonel Tanner, hadn't just been a stranger. He'd been a hero, a warrior, and Samuel had given him something no one else had. Dignity. There's more, Margaret added. Colonel Tanner's story has caught attention. People are calling about you. Veterans groups, local officials, even the diner's corporate office. You should expect some visitors. Samuel hung up, his head spinning. The apartment felt smaller, the walls closing in as he tried to process it all. A colonel, a missing hero, and somehow Samuel's small act had brought him back. But the town's scorn still burned, and he wasn't sure he was ready for whatever came next. The next morning, Haven's End was anything but quiet. Samuel stepped outside, the fog thinner now, the pier glinting under a weak sun. He hadn't slept, his mind replaying Margaret's words, the old man's face, the diner's betrayal. As he walked to the general store, he noticed something odd. People weren't staring with judgment anymore. Some nodded, others whispered, but the tone was different, almost respectful. At the store, Mrs. Haskell handed him his coffee with a shy smile. Heard you did something special, Samuel. Didn't know that old man was somebody. Samuel shrugged, uneasy with the shift. Just did what felt right. But the news was spreading faster than he could keep up. By noon, a black SUV rolled into town, its tinted windows drawing eyes. Two men in crisp suits stepped out, one carrying a briefcase, the other a badge that read, Veterans Affairs. They headed straight for Rosie's, where a small crowd had already gathered, phones out, filming the spectacle. Samuel stayed back, watching from the pier, his heart pounding. Inside the diner, the suits met with Carl, whose face was pale as a ghost. The regulars buzzed with rumours. Some said the VA was investigating, others claimed the Marines themselves were involved. But the truth came out soon enough. One of the men, a VA official named Robert Klein, addressed the crowd, his voice carrying over the diner's hum. 2 days ago, a man in this establishment showed compassion to someone society overlooked. That man, Samuel Hayes, helped us recover Colonel William Tanner, a decorated Marine who'd lost his way. We're here to set things right. The crowd parted as Klein approached Samuel, who'd been pulled into the diner by Mrs. Delaney's insistent tug. Klein extended a hand, his grip firm. On behalf of the VA and Colonel Tanner, thank you, Mr. Hayes. You've done more than you know. Samuel's face burned, the attention overwhelming. But then Klein handed him a letter, its envelope worn but sealed with a Marine Corps emblem. From the Colonel, Klein said quietly. Read it when you're ready. Samuel nodded, slipping the letter into his jacket, his hands unsteady. The diner was silent, even Carl frozen behind the counter. But the moment was shattered when a second figure stepped forward. A tall woman in her 60s, her grey hair pulled back, her eyes sharp with authority. She wore a navy blazer, a Marine Corps pin glinting on her lapel. Brigadier General Ellen Voss, she introduced herself, her voice commanding. Mr. Hayes, your actions reflect the values we hold dear. Honor, courage, compassion. We'd like to discuss how we can support you moving forward. Samuel blinked, his voice gone. Support him? He'd been fired, mocked, cast out. Now this. Before he could respond, General Voss turned to Carl, her gaze icy. And you, sir, have some explaining to do. Policies that punish kindness don't belong in a community like this. Carl stammered, his smirk long gone, as the corporate suits behind him shifted uncomfortably. The crowd murmured, some cheering, others whispering about Carl's fate. Tommy, lurking near the door, slipped out, his bravado vanished. That night, Samuel sat alone, the letter in his hands. He opened it, the paper trembling as he read. Samuel, you saw a man, not a burden. I was testing the world, searching for a reason to keep going. You gave me one. Never stop being the man you are. Bill Tanner. A small object fell from the envelope. A Marine Corps challenge coin, its edges worn but gleaming. Samuel's eyes stung, his throat tight. He'd lost his job, his place in Haven's End. But this was worth it. Clara's voice echoed in his mind. You're enough, Sam. Always were. He clutched the coin, a weight lifting from his chest. The town began to change in ways Samuel never expected. Rosie's corporate office, stung by the bad press, announced a new initiative. Free coffee for veterans, with a corner of the diner dedicated to VA resources. They offered Samuel his job back, with a raise and an apology, but he declined. Instead, he took a part-time role overseeing the veteran program, his days now spent connecting former service members with help they needed. The pier, once a place of whispers, became a gathering spot where fishermen and retirees swapped stories with vets over coffee. Mrs. Delaney started a weekly breakfast for veterans, her pancakes a small but steady gesture. Even Carl, after a public dressing down and a demotion, began to soften. He volunteered at the veteran corner, his gruff demeanour giving way to quiet respect. I was wrong, he admitted to Samuel one evening, his voice low. Thought rules mattered more than people. Samuel nodded, no grudge in his heart. Live and learn, Carl. The legacy of that night rippled beyond Haven's End. A local school launched an art contest, inspired by Samuel's story, with kids drawing pictures of quiet heroes. One, by a 12-year-old girl, showed a man in a navy jacket handing coffee to a soldier. The caption reading, "Kindness is a uniform anyone can wear." Veterans groups across Maine sent letters, some offering Samuel speaking gigs, others scholarships to finish his teaching degree. He enrolled part-time, his dream flickering back to life. Colonel Tanner, now in a specialized program, sent updates through the VA, each note ending with, Keep the faith, Samuel. 6 months later, Rosie's, now called Veterans Haven, was unrecognisable. The walls, once bare, held photos of local vets, their stories typed on small plaques. The coffee corner had spread to 3 other diners, each a beacon for those who'd served. Samuel, balancing school and his VA work, felt a purpose he hadn't known since Clara's days. He still visited the pier, the coin in his pocket, a reminder of a night that changed everything. One evening, as the sun dipped low, painting the ocean gold, Samuel saw a young vet, maybe 25, sitting alone on a bench, his eyes distant. Without a word, Samuel bought 2 coffees from a nearby stand and sat beside him. "Rough day?" he asked, offering a cup. The vet nodded, taking it, and they sat in silence, the waves crashing softly. It was enough. The circle continued. A man in a faded navy jacket walks along a foggy pier at dawn, a Marine Corps coin glinting in his hand. The ocean murmurs, the air smells of salt and hope. His face, weathered but calm, reflects a quiet strength. Soft sunlight bathes the wooden planks. Seagulls soar overhead. Close up on the coin, then his eyes, resolute and kind. This is heroism, small, steady, unstoppable. What's a moment of kindness you'll never forget? Drop it in the comments, hit that like button, subscribe and ring the bell. Stories like this deserve to be shared.